I don't believe that liberalism by itself has the resources to be able to defend itself or to recapture what has been lost. This is a moment where it's extremely important for people to focus on the kinds of questions that conservatives ask. If something's going to be saved from this conflagration, it's going to be saved using conservative tools, not liberal ones.
Welcome to the Acton Line podcast, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. In this episode, Sam Gregg sits down with award-winning political theorist Yoram Hazony to discuss Hazony's new book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery. Hazony argues that the idea that American conservatism is identical to classical liberalism is seriously mistaken. According to Hazony, the best hope for Western democracy is a return to the empiricist, religious, and nationalist traditions of America and Britain. These conservative traditions brought greatness to the English-speaking nations and became the model for national freedom for the entire world. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as previous episodes on our website at acton.org/podcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Hello, my name is Sam Gregg, and I am the Director of Research at the Acton Institute. Welcome to this Acton Line podcast. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Yoram Hazony to the podcast. Dr. Hazony is the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation and president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem, Israel. He's a leading proponent of the national conservatism movement. His previous book, The Virtue of Nationalism, won the Intercollegiate Studies Institute Conservative Book of the Year Award in 2019. He's written prolifically on many questions, both in book form, articles, and op-eds in different publications around the world. He's a graduate of Princeton with a BA from there and a PhD from Rutgers University. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife and children, and he also has 3 grandchildren. Yoram, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to see you.
Good to see you again as well. So I start most of these discussions of books by asking a question that to everyone who comes on this program. And the basic question is, it's an obvious one. So tell me why you decided to write this book being Conservatism, a Rediscovery, published by Regnery Gateway. I'm wondering why you decided to write this particular book at this particular time.
Well, 2020 was, I think, a watershed year in the history of the United States and in fact all Western nations. I think that we can describe the post World War II period as having been dominated by liberal ideas. You can say that liberal hegemony. The hegemony of liberal ideas lasted more or less from the 1960s up until the year 2020. And 2020 is the year in which a quite different ideology, woke neo-Marxism, made an astonishingly successful push to place leading liberal institutions across the United States and Britain and in other countries under its thumb with an astonishing degree of success. And at this point, I think that the assumption that liberal ideas that are focused on individual liberty and equality, are no longer hegemonic. They certainly still a great many people believe in them and are fighting for them, but the condition of a single, kind of a single overarching structure to public life, or a single kind of comprehensive public philosophy, I think, is ended, and at this point, since I'm no great admirer of the new possible worldview, the neo-Marxist worldview, and since I don't believe that liberalism by itself has the resources to be able to defend itself or to recapture what has been lost, this is a moment where it's extremely important for people to focus on the kinds of questions that conservatives ask, which are questions such as what do you actually need to do to be able to conserve anything and transmit anything, whether it's ideas or behaviors or institutions from one generation to the next. If something's going to be saved from this conflagration, it's going to be saved using conservative tools, not liberal ones. And so to make that case at this moment, I thought was a worthwhile use of my time, and I think reading it could also be a worthwhile use of the reader's time at this moment.
Well, you used the phrase liberalism, and you spoke about liberal hegemony. The word liberalism, I've always thought, it's one of these words in which many people invest quite different meanings. So someone like, let's say, John Rawls, for example, certainly would describe himself as a liberal. Another person such as, I guess, F.A. Hayek certainly described himself as a liberal. Yet they had very different views on all sorts of things, particularly questions of the relative balance of liberty and equality in society, and even what they meant by those things. So I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what you mean when you use this phrase liberalism, whether it's liberal tools or liberal institutions or liberal ideas. What do you have in mind?
Well, in the book, I describe what I call the Enlightenment liberal paradigm, and this is a fundamental view, a way of understanding politics that I studied in high school, growing up in New Jersey, and then studied as an undergraduate at Princeton, and then once again for my doctorate in political theory at Rutgers. This is kind of the main framework that people use for thinking about politics in democratic countries, and it begins with the assumption that people are by nature free and equal, and that obligations are in general taken upon, assumed by the individual on the basis of consent, and that reasoning individuals will be able to figure out that since human beings are by nature free and equal, the only legitimate purpose of government is doing those things that are necessary in order to protect that freedom and that equality. And that's a worldview that you mentioned Rawls and Hayek. Both of them broadly do accept that worldview. I mean, there's a very interesting discussion to be had about how Hayek, who is epistemologically an empiricist, actually succeeds in ending up in that place. But setting that aside, I think that it's correct to say that the public culture, the public philosophy of that kind of liberalism has in fact been dominant in most Western countries, and that the debates between people who put a greater emphasis on freedom and people put a greater emphasis on equality, those debates are to a certain degree inside the family. A conservative is not inside that family. Conservatives certainly see individual liberty and equality before the law as crucial purposes of government and crucial institutions in our political culture. But a conservative begins from a different place. Conservatives begin with the question of what would be necessary in order for a given society, for any society, to be able to strengthen itself and transmit itself over many generations. And when you begin by asking that question, you immediately hit a different set of basic assumptions about what politics is about. You have to take a look at what it is that makes that holds human beings together, that holds families and societies together. So you have to speak in terms of things like social cohesion. Social cohesion is something that takes place in societies where honor is given between the different groups within the society. Honor builds mutual loyalty and makes the society resilient, and those kinds of considerations of who and what is to be honored, and how does that affect the capacity of the society to hold together rather than disintegrating. Those are subjects that are almost entirely absent from political education, at least the political education that I received in the United States. And in fact, in general, most people don't speak about these things anymore. So there's actually a competition between that liberal framework and the conservative framework, which I call the conservative paradigm, for the space within the minds of the people who are thinking about politics. And my argument is that as long as it is the liberal paradigm that you mostly spend your time thinking about, then you are blind to, and in general unable to do, those things that are necessary in order for a country like the United States to survive. And at this moment, I think it couldn't be more evident that the chain of transmission has been broken, and the United States and Britain are undergoing kind of an ongoing cultural revolution, and we have to let the liberal paradigm go a bit and open our minds to a different way of thinking of things if we're going to save ourselves.
So chapter 3 is where you introduce this idea of the conservative paradigm. And you say a paradigm consists of fundamental concepts and the principles by which these concepts are related to one another. A well-framed paradigm, you go on to say, will capture the most consequential features of the domain being studied, whereas a poorly framed one will let crucial elements slip away unnoticed. And then you say, but whether well-framed or not, a paradigm always involves a reduction or simplification of the material. There is always something that has been left out. So on that basis, here's a common critique that I've heard of your book and the way that you've addressed some of these issues, not just in terms of this particular book, but also the virtues of nationalism, which was the one which you won a Conservative Book of the Year award for, and back in 2019. And the criticism is this, that when you use phrases like conservatism, liberalism, nationalism, that you're skating over important distinctions that exist between different types of conservatives, different types of liberals, different types of nationalists. And if that is the case, that these differences are being somewhat blurred, does this method run the risk of effectively oversimplifying the complexity of some of these matters? Because you and I both know people who describe themselves as liberals or conservatives who actually have very, very different views on all sorts of different subjects. So I'm wondering here, I guess it's a methodological question. Does the paradigm that you're building tend to exclude some of these complexities that are not necessarily just marginal, but often very fundamental to differences that, say, a group of conservatives may have among themselves? Whether it's something like the degree to which some conservatives describe themselves, say, as fundamentally skeptics, and others say, no, I'm a conservative because I'm fundamentally a religious person. So could you say something about this issue?
Well, I think those are two different questions. I mean, in terms of methodology, the question is very apt and very well, but it's definitely something that we need to think about. It's unfortunate that simplicity, that the way the human mind works is that we're able to understand things best where the array of concepts and principles that we're using are few and simple. And the more you multiply concepts and principles, the more difficult it becomes to understand anything. So historians tend very much towards nuance in order to make their stories extremely precise, but it's often very difficult to understand, what history is urging upon us from a good history book. And the fields like political theory and philosophy seek a much greater simplicity in order that we be able to understand. And that's in fact precisely the reason that liberalism, as I've defined it, Enlightenment liberalism, has been so successful, is that it's such an extraordinarily simple system of ideas. I mean, basically, you have freedom, equality, consent, and reason, and the entire theory is built out of those. You can add rights if you like, but basically, my argument is that liberalism blinds us to so very much because of the fact that it's so simple. Its simplicity is precisely what blinds us. We think that we understand that invading Afghanistan can lead to liberal democracy in Afghanistan. We don't understand the capacity for cohesion of a society that is traditional and is fighting against these concepts. And it's the simplicity of our views that makes it, of liberal views, I mean, that makes policy building based on it so catastrophic. So that argument will surely apply to my books as well, since my goal is to compete with liberalism by also offering a simple, powerful theory. Although, if you read that chapter 3, you'll see that my entire argument is based on a reduction in simplicity. That what I've done is I've taken 7 or 8 different concepts, that most of which we've touched on already: cohesion and disillusion, hierarchy, honor, the idea of a traditional institution, the idea of the nation. All of these are ideas that are left out of the liberal framework and are included in this broader conservative framework. That's why I think it's a better theory. But the claim that I'm leaving things out is certainly admissible and probably true.
Well, here's another thing I'd like to, just working on what you just said. You've mentioned reason and you've mentioned tradition a number of times. And tradition is obviously something that conservatives of all stripes tend to be interested in and attached to varying degrees and in varying ways, but nonetheless tradition in the sense of this transmission of knowledge over time through customs, through habits, and you and I would probably say ultimately through religion is central to the whole way that a conservative thinks about the world. And you associate liberalism in your book with what you call on many occasions enlightened rationalism, which I presume you're really talking here about the Enlightenment movements that emerged in the 18th century, or towards the end of the 17th century, and then had a very powerful impact upon the European and Western mind in the 18th century, across traditions, across countries, across nations. So that brings me to the person of Edmund Burke, who obviously is a person that is a major reference point for conservatives and a good number of classical liberals, for that matter, as well. So Burke is a figure that is going to figure significantly in any discussion about conservatism and contemporary liberalism. He's a man that takes tradition very seriously. This is probably most evident in his reflections on the revolution in France. But is there a risk with your book that you downplay the attention that people like Burke gave to reason? And by reason, I don't here mean empiricism. I'm really talking about natural law and this tradition of natural law thinking that's been so integral to the history of the West. So I'm pointing to this broad attention between tradition on the one hand and reason on the other. And your book tends to, I think, posit conservatism as the repository of tradition and liberalism as the repository of reason, or at least a particular type of reason. So does that actually work out, though? Is it the case that these things are necessarily in tension, or is it the case that conservatism tries to bring these things together?
I think there are two different ways of thinking about natural law. There's a rationalist way of thinking about natural law, and there's an empiricist way of natural law. The rationalist says, and in this, rationalist natural lawyers are actually quite similar to rationalist liberals. The rationalist says there are things that are immutable and unchanging about nature. These things are more or less fully accessible to human reason. That means that people who are reasoning properly in every time and place can come to the same conclusions because the natural law itself does not vary, and the capacity of reason does not vary, and therefore the conclusions can simply stand in a fixed way throughout all eternity. An empiricist also may believe, I think often does, as the Hebrew Bible does, for example. An empiricist thought does believe that there are natural laws, meaning laws that derive from the nature of human beings and the nature of human societies, and that hold good in all times and places. But the empiricist is extremely skeptical about our capacity to reach any kind of final conclusion about the content of those laws. And the reason for this is that empiricists look at the history of reasoning and the examples of Burke's great teacher, John Selden, or Burke himself are very good examples of this. Empiricists look at human history and they say, when and where has there actually been agreement among people who exercise reason? And the answer that they give is virtually never. That individual societies disagree with one another and traditions disagree with one another. And for that matter, even individuals within a certain society constantly disagree about the most fundamental things. And all we need to do is compare the views of the Catholic natural lawyers who claim to be exercising universal reason with the views of Enlightenment liberals who also claim to be exercising universal reason, and you immediately see and compare both of them to the views of Marxist theoreticians who also claim to be exercising universal reason. You'll see that all three of these schools come to completely different conclusions, all of them exercising quite good reason in many cases, but they don't reach conclusions. So, they don't reach a single conclusion. Reason is incapable of putting that kind of argument to an end, according to empiricists, and conservatives are empiricists. And so conservatives are, in fact, a little bit more skeptical about reason. we like reason as much as anybody else does. We do our best to use reason in order to reach the best possible conclusions. But I think that conservatives are more humble and more skeptical about the capacity of any particular person or society or culture to grasp ultimate truths that are binding on everyone else, just because we're not very good at this. So when you're speaking about somebody like Burke, it's certainly true that he, like many other conservatives, of his generation, agrees that there's such a thing as natural law. So does Selden. So do the other thinkers in this Anglo-American conservative tradition. But the question is, what do they do with it? The question is whether they believe that you can simply exercise reason and deduce directly from natural law things that are a kind of a constitution for the way that society ought to be. And Burke's answer to this is absolutely no, that the way that we as a society approach an understanding of what nature requires is through what he calls long experience, the experience of many generations and centuries. He definitely believes that the British Constitution is the best constitution that has ever been established among nations, and in this he's in agreement with John Adams, who in 1787 publishes the first volume of his 3-volume work on the constitutions of the United States. And Adams likewise makes this argument. He says the British Constitution is the best that there has ever been. He surveys constitutions throughout human history, every constitution that he can find, in order to make the argument historically that the British Constitution is the best. And what's good about the American constitutions, in John Adams' view, is that they are so close to the British Constitution. So all of these thinkers certainly believe that there is such a thing as human nature, there is such a thing as the nature of human societies, and a constitution is best when it reflects that nature. But they don't believe that that nature can be derived from self-evident principles, whether self-evident principles of reason or universally evident dictates of experience. They don't believe that can be done, and they don't believe that you can deduce from those self-evident principles to the Constitution that would be best. So it's simply a mistake. I think that many very good and fine thinkers make this mistake today, to think that every time somebody talks about nature in the conservative tradition, what he's talking about is a nature that is simply knowable to everyone, and that can be the foundation from which you deduce legal and moral conclusions. That Burke does not believe, and he says explicitly that he doesn't accept that.
You and I one day are going to have to sit down and have a fun conversation about natural law at some point, I suspect, in the future. But I
thought today was the day. I was all ready for it today.
Well, there's lots of things we could say about natural law, and particularly its relationship to constitutionalism and the way that these things relate to each other, as well as what I would argue is a fair amount of agreement across cultures about different points. But I'd like to move on, and we've been talking a lot about history, right? We've been talking about the past, we've been talking about different theories. I'd like to move now to something, to an area of your book where you directly engage the American conservatism that emerged after the 1950s, particularly with people like Frank Meyer and others. And it's fair to say, I think, that you're skeptical of the fusionist project. You're skeptical about its coherence. You tend to be more skeptical about the respective weight given to virtue and liberty in the fusionist experiment. And I actually think that's one of the things that you really do narrow in on. And I think it's fair to say that the Fusionist project is in some respects a response to a particular point in time, rather than something that's been worked out on a deep theoretical level. I tend to agree with you about that. But at the same time, conservatism, like all sorts of other different political movements, need to be reacting to what's going on around them. And in the 1950s, it's fair to say that people who were self-consciously conservative, self-consciously, or in some cases, consciously classical liberal, or even in some cases libertarian, which is a whole different category. These people were very much alone. They needed to form alliances with each other, etc. So my point, I guess, I'm looking at in this regard is this. When it comes to fusionism, can you describe what's your basic critique of it as a theory? And why do you think, as you seem to imply in various parts of the book, that American conservatism needs to move beyond the shadow of people like Frank Meyer, who are very much associated with the Fusionist project?
I think I should start by emphasizing that William Buckley's Cold War conservatism, which by the mid-1960s was being called Fusionism, it was important, and it achieved extremely important things. I mean, it was from the start an alliance of liberals and conservatives. Liberals like Frank Meyer, who I think frankly detested the conservatism of traditional conservative like Russell Kirk. I mean, Frank Meyer's book on the subject is from 1962. It's overwhelmingly an attack on Edmund Burke and on Russell Kirk. Very little of it is an attack on socialism. It's almost all an attack on conservatism. So, look, putting those two characters and those two different worldviews, which Kirk said it's like attempting a fusion between fire and ice. In one movement, it would never have happened, except that it was a political necessity. And I agree with the political necessity. I mean, I think that in a world that had been swamped by socialism, including the United States and Britain and Europe, socialism and advancing socialism at home, and at the same time communism rampant abroad and expanding. Under those conditions, I simply think that a conservative who is unwilling to sit with a liberal in an alliance would have been a fool, and so it's historically very important that those liberals and conservatives sat together as allies. That's what ultimately gave the basis for the Reagan-Thatcher moment, and for the defeat of Soviet communism abroad, and for the rolling back of socialism for an entire generation in America and Britain and elsewhere. So that's what's good about fusionism. What's bad about fusionism is that the particular form of the alliance, I think, was mistaken. It's easy for me to say that with hindsight. But if we want to know why is it that this was an alliance of liberals and conservatives, yet by the time that Reagan and Thatcher had left the stage, conservatism had been as thoroughly uprooted and defeated as communism. I think if we want to understand how it can be that the heirs to Reagan and Thatcher, who were in many respects traditionalists and nationalists and believed in religion and not only in freedom, as did many of of their associates and intellectuals who were writing at the time. How can it be that a movement like that, which Irving Kristol, for example, described as being based on religion, nationalism, and economic growth, where of the three, religion is the most important, Kristol wrote. So how can a movement of that kind have immediately, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, by the early 1990s, immediately given birth to a world in which conservatism doesn't exist and almost doesn't exist, and a movement that takes liberal principles and insists on creating a worldwide, universal, liberal kind of an empire, the end of history and liberal internationalism as the purpose of the so-called conservative movement. I mean, there's no chance that Reagan or Thatcher would ever have supported any such thing, and yet it was the immediate consequence. And so when we look back to try to understand how such a catastrophic failure of fusionism could have arisen, I think that when you go back and read the original documents, it's very clear that the deal, the fusionist deal, is one in which liberalism is the public philosophy that conservatives support, and conservatism, religious traditionalism, personal patriotism, and nationalism is the private philosophy that conservatives will support, and that fusion of a public liberalism with a private conservatism apparently doesn't work. I mean, it was tried for 2 generations. It was successful on the liberal fronts and a complete failure on the conservative fronts. And so I think that today, when we again face not dissimilar conditions of a rapidly rising woke neo-Marxism at home and a rapidly rising Chinese authoritarianism abroad. Once again, we're in the same kind of condition where conservatives are not strong enough, I believe, to be able to take these things on alone without the help of anti-Marxist liberals. And anti-Marxist liberals after 2020 are themselves a small and rapid a small band of individuals who are heavily under siege. I do think we're going to have to work together, but I don't think the basis for working together can be fusionism, because what's missing in fusionism is any kind of an awareness that the transmission of anything that we value from the past. I include things like God and Scripture and a Christian or Jewish moral vision, the honor given to the Bible as the basis of our civilization. But I also include, precious Anglo-American customs like like freedom of speech and religious toleration. All of these things can continue and persist only under conditions in which there is a public conservatism, in which not only government but public institutions of all kinds are involved in explicitly and constantly giving honor to traditional norms of different kinds, which we need to have persist if we want to see America or Britain or the West in general survive the coming years.
Well, here's a question that follows up, I think, naturally from that. I'm not unsympathetic to that argument, because when I hear claims about the need for law to be neutral or for government to be neutral regarding any number of moral questions, I always say there's no such thing. There's no such thing as neutrality of law. Law, by definition, is concerned with questions of justice. Justice is not a neutral thing. some of the things like freedom of speech and other such things that you mentioned, these are grounded upon certain value commitments and a certain understanding of what's necessary if you're going to have people being able to pursue truth relatively freely, etc. But I suppose the question that naturally comes out from what you just said is, how does one do that? How does one establish a type of public conservatism of the type that you're describing? One that, as you've said in a number of occasions throughout your book, where religion, particularly Judaism and Christianity, and I'm assuming you have a type of small o orthodox versions of these things in mind, at least at some level. How does one do that in a country like, for example, the United States, or Britain for that matter, or most Western countries for that matter, where religion per se is becoming more and more marginalized, both in public discourse, but also in terms of even people's private lives as well, right? And the way that they live their lives. We've seen in the United States and other countries the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as people who say they have no particular attachment to a particular form of religion, let alone a specific synagogue or church. So how does one do that? Is it possible to establish the type of public conservatism you're talking about in a West in which religion has either been marginalized or, to a certain extent in some cases, actually self-marginalized itself from these types of discussions?
Well, this is not a traditional American, certainly not British condition. The elimination of the separation of church and state appears for the first time in American constitutional jurisprudence in 1947. That is, as I write in the book, it is a reaction to the horrors of the world wars, and the reaction to the racism of the Nazis is, it's certainly a very, very good reason for Americans to have said things like, look, we just sacrificed 500,000 lives in order to defeat Nazi racism, and we can't conscience the continuation of Jim Crow and the persecution of the Black minority in the American South. I'm extremely sympathetic to that argument, but the constitutional revolution that began in the 1940s and reached its culmination in the 1960s in America was not only about the elimination of discrimination between blacks and whites. One of its central planks was driving religion out of the public sphere, beginning in the public schools, and then ultimately simply out of public life in general. The banning of prayer and the teaching of religion and the Bible was a crucial turning point that transformed America from a Christian democracy, or what FDR had called a God-fearing democracy, into this new experiment of liberal democracy, where liberalism replaces Christianity as the public culture of the United States, and that's imposed top down by the American Supreme Court, although Congress also had quite a bit to do with it. I think that the United States, now that liberalism, hegemonic liberalism, has collapsed, I think a great many people should be open to a couple of things. One of them is a return to democracy and federalism on these issues. That is, the American Supreme Court, beginning in the late 1940s, decided to expropriate very, very large areas having to do with religion, family, society, to take all of these issues away from the states and to impose a liberal order from Washington. This should be regarded as unconstitutional, meaning that Americans should regard this as an abuse of the American Constitution and a great mistake. And at this point, if conservatives can understand clearly that this is what has happened, then I assume that what they will want to do is to permit to repeal the nationwide imposition of separation of church and state, and to permit different states to experiment with different kinds of legal structures with respect to Christianity and public religion. I agree with you that there are many places in the United States that will not that will not be interested in this kind of thing, but there are many states and regions in America where there's still a Christian majority and where people are extremely concerned. And by the way, not only Christians, I mean, or Orthodox Jews, and I think many other traditionalists as well, are extremely concerned about the transition that we're seeing to a kind of neo-Marxist cultural revolution as the official ideology of the United States. And the best way to fight it is by resuscitating biblical traditions and the Christian moral vision. In my view, I think it would be best to have carve-outs and accommodations, as I think most Americans would support for people who are not Christian, like myself. But I think that the general direction should be for states to fight the new public religion of woke neo-Marxism with the old public religion of a biblically based Christian public life. And how exactly that looks will be a series of experiments. Different states, and different countries in Europe are going to try different things. And some of them will work and some of them won't work. And we'll get to see what is successful. But the important thing is to achieve a restoration at this point, because the experiment of a strictly purely liberal democracy has failed. It's collapsed into something horrible, and we're going to have to resuscitate that FDR idea of a God-fearing democracy, and see what that looks like and how well that stacks up.
I suspect that the Dobbs case, if it turns out the way that I suspect it's going to turn out in the Supreme Court, we may see some of that happening, what you've just described, happening with a number of laws surrounding human life and other such questions being very different in different states throughout the United States. But let's turn towards the end now, and I'd like to talk about Chapter 9 of your book, which is Some Notes on Living a Conservative Life. Now, this is interesting because much of your work in this book is presenting a theory, presenting what you think a conservative paradigm is, and laying it out and putting it in opposition to other forms of paradigms, liberalism, etc. So what I'd like to ask, first of all, why did you decide to end the book on this very personal note? I mean, you talk about yourself, your wife Julie, your courtship, the way that you basically developed what might be called a conservative outlook and conservative lifestyle, a praxis of conservatism, so to speak, in the context of a society and a culture which was anything but any of those things. So I'd like to get a sense from you of why you decided to end the book this way, and secondly, to say something about the role of religion in this living a conservative life as you presented at the end of the book.
Well, I'll begin with the point about religion, which if I haven't emphasized that enough, I'm sorry. Every society has a public philosophy or a public religion. It may be, spelled out explicitly. Much of it is often very much implicit. But an outsider coming into any society can study it and identify, what is the basic religious or philosophical framework on which things are based. And the main traditional religions in Western countries, which are different forms of Christianity and, of course, also Judaism, for the last couple of thousand years, those offer something that a way of life and a way of transmitting inherited ideas and behaviors and institutions from generation to generation, that simply cannot be compared to anything else that Americans or Brits or Europeans have at their disposal. Religion is in our experience, the one thing that we know is capable of transmitting itself over centuries and, in fact, thousands of years. So when we talk about a restoration of traditions, we also have to focus not just on sort of the kind of these abstract, what should the Supreme Court think and what should the Supreme Court rule. Those are very, very abstract issues, and the real problem in the West, as you suggested when you alluded to the rise of the nuns, is the real problem in the West is not so much the public culture, which is terrible, as it is the fact that young people or older people who want to return to a conservative life. Let's say that you want, you feel that you need or want a life of conservation and transmission. You want to be able to marry, to raise up children, to stay married, to teach your children things that they will then, to some significant degree, honor and perpetuate. I mean, the parents can't actually control what their children are going to end up thinking and doing. That's a complete myth. But if someone wants these things, wants to be able to enter into a traditional conservative life, to become a conservative person, well, there's no way to do that from books. Books can't teach you how to live. The only way you can learn how to live is from other people who live a certain way. And many people ask me now, how could I possibly be part of a Christian or an Orthodox Christian or an Orthodox Jewish life? I wasn't raised to believe these things. My parents didn't believe these things. My parents may even have despised these things. And so I have nothing. I have no traditions that have been handed down. What should I do? It seems impossible. And this is a very poignant question. It's pointed. It's right. It's an exact snapshot of where many millions of young people are right now. The young women, the young men that Jordan Peterson writes about, or the young women that Abigail Shrier writes about. These are young men and women who have inherited almost nothing, and they know it. And the question is, must they simply fall prey to these calls for dictatorship coming at us from all sorts of characters on the political right, or to the calls for to spend your life in sexual exploration coming at us from the left? I think the answer is no. They don't have to do that. And since my wife and I, since Julie and I actually returned from a liberal life without a great deal of the cultural inheritance that we wanted for our children, we returned to Orthodox Jewish practice. We returned to an Orthodox family life, an Orthodox congregational life and an Orthodox education for our children. None of this is easy to do, but I included in the book because I wanted people to see that it is possible, that it's simply somewhat a thing, although it's difficult to do, it's a thing that a young man or a young woman or even older people, older couple whose children, went away to college and never came back, and all people can become a part and play a role in the chain of transmission of the great heritage from older generations to next generations. But it requires, at this point in time, what it requires is finding an Orthodox congregation, as we did, approaching it from a standpoint of humility, approaching an Orthodox congregation from a standpoint of saying, we see that you are handing down the tradition. We come here to learn how to transmit and conserve things ourselves. That is the way that individuals and families can both save themselves from dissolution, from this dissolute liberal lifestyle. They can save themselves. They can save their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren by doing this. And they can contribute to the salvation of their nation. So I think that there's nothing more desired, necessary, and admirable at this moment than for people to admit that things have gone wrong and that they can do something about it themselves with their own hands by adopting a conservative life and becoming conservative people.
So you end the last 4 lines of your book in the conclusion. Conservatism begins at home. I think that's a good place to conclude this podcast. Yoram Hazony, thank you very much for joining us. It's been great to talk with you. For those of you who are interested, Yoram Hazony, again, is the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation and president of the Herzl Institute. His previous book, The Virtue of Nationalism, won the Intercollegiate Studies Conservative Book of the Year Award in 2011. And we've been discussing today his newly released book, Conservatism, a Rediscovery, published by Regnery Gateway and available from all good bookshops and, of course, on places like Amazon.com. Yoram, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Sam.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line,